In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one space marine who brought a set of sculpting tools into his new life as a walking fortress of ceramite, because someone had to remember the names of the dead. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story is the testimony of Urdhen Velk, 3rd Company, Salamanders chapter. 63 years of service, a chest full of obsidian tablets carved with every name he could learn, and a blade he forged himself and named That Which Shields, a name he would spend the rest of his career trying to deserve. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. The first thing they tell you when you earn the right to wear the green is that you will burn. Not as a warning, as a promise. They hold the brand against your chest, right over where the second heart sits, and the pain is a white-hot wire threaded through every nerve you own. You smell your own flesh cooking. You feel the scar tissue forming even as the iron pulls away. And the chaplain, the Igniax, he looks you in the eyes and says, "This is the first truth. Remember it. I have remembered it through 63 years of war, across more worlds than I care to name, and I can tell you now that the Igniax was right. Everything that followed, every battle, every loss, every silence where a brother's voice used to be, all of it comes back to that single moment when the brand kissed my skin and I understood what it meant to be a son of Vulkan. My name is Urdhen Velk. I am a battle brother of the Salamanders chapter, 3rd Company, and I have served Vulkan and the Emperor and the people of his Imperium since the day I walked out of the fires of my initiation on Nocturne and into a galaxy that was already tearing itself apart. The Great Rift had opened. The sky above Nocturne, which had always been a bruised and volcanic thing, full of ash clouds and the red glow of lava rivers, now carried a new wound, a purple-pink scar that stretched from horizon to horizon like a diseased vein. We could see it between the eruptions. We could feel it in the warp, those of us with enough sensitivity to notice such things. The Imperium had been cut in half, and every world on the wrong side of that wound was screaming for help that could not reach them. I was young then, freshly forged, as we say. My body was still adjusting to the gifts of the gene seed, the secondary heart thumping out of rhythm with the first, the Becher's gland occasionally flooding my mouth with acid when I ate too quickly, the coal-black skin of Vulkan's bloodline pulled tight over muscles that had doubled in mass within a single year. I was clumsy with my own strength in those early days. I remember crushing a ceramic cup in the refectory simply by gripping it while listening to a senior brother tell a story about fighting orcs in the ash wastes. The cup exploded in my fist, and everyone at the table went silent, and then Brother Torvaan Gesht, who was sitting across from me, started laughing. Not a mocking laugh, a warm one, the kind that says I did the same thing last month, and I am glad it is someone else's turn now. That was how I met Torvaan, over a broken cup and a puddle of recaf spreading across the stone table. He had been elevated to full battle brother status only 8 months before me, which, in Salamander terms, made him practically my twin. We were assigned to the same squad under Sergeant Rendok Vosk, a broad-shouldered veteran whose face was so covered in honor scars that his features had become a topographic map of decades of warfare. Vosk spoke rarely, but when he did, you listened because every word he said was a load-bearing wall in a structure of experience you could not yet comprehend. 3rd Company was mustering for deployment. The Indomitus Crusade had reached our sector, and with it came Primaris reinforcements, gene-forged warriors created by Archmagos Call from our own Primarch's bloodline. I will not pretend there was no tension. These Primaris brothers were larger than us, equipped with weapons we had never seen, and they carried themselves with the particular confidence of soldiers who have been designed for war rather than shaped by it. But they were sons of Vulkan nonetheless. They bore the black skin. Their eyes glowed with the same ember-orange heat as ours. And when the chaplains tested them in the rituals of the Promethean cult, when they held their hands in the sacred flames and recited the canticle of immolation without flinching, the old suspicions melted away like slag from good iron. They were our brothers. That was enough. Our first deployment as a full squad came 3 months after my elevation. The world was called Korveth Tertius, a hive world in the Drukari system that had been cut off from Imperial supply lines since the Great Rift opened. For 2 standard years, the population of 11 billion had been slowly starving, while an Ork warband that had broken apart in the warp storms battered at the hive walls like a green-skinned tide against crumbling rock. The planetary governor had sent astropathic distress calls for months before one finally punched through the interference. By the time we arrived, 2 of the planet's 7 hives had already fallen. I remember the approach in the Thunderhawk. The viewport showed me a world that looked sick, its atmosphere choked with the brown-gray haze of burning infrastructure. The night side lit not by city lights, but by the orange glow of fires that had been burning for weeks. Torvaan was sitting next to me, checking the seals on his flamer for the 4th time, a ritual of readiness rather than genuine concern. Across from us, Brother Ilarieth was murmuring the litany of the Drake under his breath, his lips barely moving inside his helm. Sergeant Vosk sat at the front of the bay, perfectly still, his thunder hammer across his knees. He had not spoken since the briefing. When the Thunderhawk shook with atmospheric entry, none of us flinched. We had trained for this. We had been born for this. What I was not prepared for was the smell. The moment the assault ramp dropped and the air of Korveth Tertius rushed into the bay, it hit me like a physical force. A wall of stench composed of rotting flesh, burning plastics, sewage from cracked waste processing plants, and something else underneath all of it. Something sweet and cloying that I would later learn was the scent of mass graves, where bodies had been covered in chemical accelerant and set alight. It was the smell of a civilization dying. I had trained in the volcanic wastelands of Nocturne, where the air itself could scorch your lungs, where toxic gases vented from fissures without warning. But nothing had prepared me for the specific quality of suffering that a dying hive city produces. It is not just a physical odor. It gets into your memory. It lives there. We deployed into the outskirts of Hive Protheus, the largest remaining population center, where approximately 3 billion people were packed into a structure that had been designed for 2. The refugees from the fallen hives had fled here, cramming into every hab block, every corridor, every ventilation shaft and maintenance tunnel. The Orks had surrounded the hive and were launching daily assaults on the lower gates, probing attacks designed to find weakness. They had already breached the outer wall in 3 places, and Imperial Guard units, what remained of the Korveth 14th and 22nd Regiments, were bleeding themselves dry trying to hold the gaps. Our mission was to reinforce the defense and, when sufficient forces had gathered, to launch a counter-offensive to break the siege. Sergeant Vosk led us into the breach at Gate 17 on our first day. The Orks had smashed through a section of the outer wall using a crude battering ram cobbled together from the chassis of a Lehman Russ tank they had captured and welded onto the front of a looted transport. The gap was 30 meters wide, and the guard had been trying to hold it with sandbag emplacements and overlapping fields of fire from heavy bolter positions on the wall above. It was not enough. It was never enough against Orks because Orks do not understand attrition the way humans do. They do not care about losses. They pour into a gap like water into a crack, And if you kill the first 100, the 101st simply climbs over the corpses of his fellows and keeps coming. I killed my first orc that day. It came through the breach at a dead sprint, a creature nearly as tall as I was, its green hide covered in crude armor plates bolted directly into its flesh. It was screaming, the guttural wag that is half war cry and half psychic emanation, a sound that triggers something primal in the human brain, in any brain, a recognition of raw, predatory intent. I raised my bolter and put 3 rounds into its chest. The mass reactive shells detonated inside its torso and blew out its back in a spray of green ichor and shattered bone. But the thing kept running for another 2 steps before its legs realized its body was dead. It collapsed at my feet, its jaw still working, its eyes still burning with that idiot joy that orcs carry into everything they do. I put a 4th round through its skull and moved on, because there were more behind it. Always more. There are always more orcs. Torvaan was beside me with his flamer, and the weapon sang in his hands. That is the only word for it. The stream of liquid fire that poured from the nozzle was not just a weapon discharge. It was an expression of everything we are as salamanders, the primordial fury of Nocturne's volcanoes, channeled through imperial engineering and directed by a will that had been hardened in the forges of our chapter. Torvaan swept the flame across the breach, and the orcs caught in its path did not simply die. They came apart, their flesh boiling, their crude ammunition cooking off in their bandoliers, secondary explosions rippling through their ranks. The stench was appalling, the greasy black smoke of burning orc flesh mixing with the chemical tang of flamer fuel, but I did not have time to be revolted. You never do in combat. There is only the next target, the next trigger pull, the next step forward. We held Gate 17 for 9 hours that first day. When the orcs finally broke off their assault, not because we had beaten them, but because something shinier had caught their war boss's attention on the other side of the hive, we were standing in a carpet of dead greenskins that was, in places, piled waist-high. My armor was streaked with blood, both green and human, and my bolter's barrel was hot enough to sizzle when rain touched it. Sergeant Vosk moved among us, checking each brother for injuries, and when he reached me, he paused, looked at the kill field behind me, and gave me a single nod. That was all. One nod. From Vosk, that was practically a standing ovation. But the battle at the gate was not what I remember most about Korveth Tertius. What I remember most happened 3 days later, during a lull in the fighting, when Vosk took our squad into the lower levels of the hive to assess the condition of the civilian population. What we found down there broke something open inside me that has never fully closed. The lower hab blocks had become a refugee camp, though calling it that implies a level of organization that did not exist. It was a mass of humanity pressed together in conditions that would have shamed a prison world. Families were living in spaces meant for single workers, 8 or 10 people crammed into rooms designed for one, with no sanitation, no clean water, and rations that amounted to a handful of corpse starch paste twice a day if they were lucky. The air was thick with the smell of sickness and unwashed bodies. And the sound, the constant low sound of thousands of people existing in misery, was a hum that got into your bones and stayed there. Children sat in corridors with eyes that had gone flat and empty, the look of young minds that have shut down to protect themselves from a reality too harsh to process. Old people lay against walls, too weak to move, waiting to die with a patience that was more terrible than any scream. I am a space marine. I was made to fight the enemies of mankind, to destroy the Xenos and the heretic and the mutant. I was not made to feel the things I felt in that lower hab block. And yet I did feel them, Because I am a Salamander, and the Promethean Creed does not allow us the luxury of emotional distance. We are the Emperor's warriors, yes, but we are also the Emperor's shield, and a shield that does not care what it protects is just a slab of metal. Vulkan taught us that. The people we defend are not abstractions. They are not numbers on a strategic display. They are flesh and blood. They are mothers and sons and daughters and fathers, and every single one of them matters. Not because they are useful, not because they serve some greater strategic purpose, but because they are human, and they are ours to protect. That is the burden we carry. It is the heaviest thing I have ever lifted, and I have lifted a collapsing bulkhead with my bare hands. I stopped beside a woman who was holding a child, a boy of perhaps 4 or 5 years old, though malnutrition had made his age difficult to judge. The child was staring at me with wide eyes, not afraid exactly, but overwhelmed by the sheer size of me in my power armor. I am over 2 meters tall in my bare skin. In full plate, I am a walking fortress of ceramite and fury. To a child, I must have looked like something out of a nightmare. I knelt down, which is not easy in Mark 7 armor, the servos in the knee joints protesting with a mechanical whine. And I removed my helmet. I let the child see my face, the coal-black skin, the glowing orange eyes, the honor scars that crossed my cheeks in patterns that his young mind probably read as some kind of tribal marking. The boy stared at me for a long time, and then he reached out and touched my face with one small, dirty hand. His fingers were cold. I could feel them even through the reduced sensitivity of my altered skin. "Are you a monster?" he asked. "No," I said. "I am your shield." He did not understand what that meant. He was too young. But his mother did, and she started crying. Not from fear, but from relief. A long-held breath finally let out, the way someone weeps when they have been holding themselves together for so long that any kindness, any sign that someone has come to help, breaks the dam. I stayed with them for a few minutes, which was all I could spare, and I gave the woman a ration pack from my own supplies, the dense nutrient bars that are formulated for Astartes metabolism but will sustain a human family for days. It was against regulations. I did not care. Torvaan found me after, and he did not say anything. He just put his hand on my shoulder, a gesture that between salamanders carries a weight that words cannot match, and we walked back to the defensive line together. That night, in the brief rest period between shifts, I took out a piece of obsidian I had brought from Nocturne, a shard of volcanic glass no larger than my palm, and I began to carve. I had been a sculptor before my transformation, one of the stoneworkers of Heshed, the third sanctuary city, where the tradition of memorial carving stretches back to before the Emperor found Vulkan. We carve the names of the dead into obsidian so that the mountain remembers them. I had brought the skill with me into my new life, along with a small set of tools that the chapter's tech Marines had modified to work with my enhanced hands. That night, I carved the name of every guardsman I had seen die at Gate 17. 37 names in script so small that a normal human would need a magnifying lens to read them. I did not know most of their names. I asked the guard officers, and they told me, and when they could not tell me, I carved Unknown Korveth 14th, or Unknown Korveth 22nd, because even a soldier without a name deserves to be remembered. It became my practice. After every battle, every engagement, I would find a quiet moment and I would carve. Obsidian is not easy to work, even with tools designed for the purpose. It is brittle, prone to fracturing along invisible fault lines if you push too hard, and the shards are razor sharp, capable of cutting even Astartes skin if you are careless. But that difficulty is part of the point. The Promethean Creed teaches us that nothing of value comes without effort, that the forge demands patience and precision as much as strength. The same is true of memory. If remembering the dead were easy, it would not mean anything. The siege of Korveth Tertius lasted another 4 months before relief forces arrived. In that time, I carved 11 obsidian tablets, each one packed with names in tiny, precise script. Some of the names were brothers. Brother Drathmere, killed by an Ork rocket that punched through his chest plate during the assault on Gate 9. Brother Promethean Salt, the youngest member of our squad, who caught a sluggar round in the neck seal of his armor, a 1 in 1,000 shot that punched through at the precise angle to sever both jugulars before his secondary heart could compensate. Salt bled out in Torvaan's arms, and I had never seen Torvaan's face look like that before. The way the ember glow of his eyes seemed to dim, as if the fire inside him had been doused for a moment. We burned Salt's body that night in a pyre built from Ork wreckage, and each of us thrust our arms into the flames, as the Promethean Creed demands, and the pain of the fire was a relief because it was clean and honest, and it burned away the helplessness that had been building in my chest since the boy in the lower hab block had asked me if I was a monster. When the siege finally broke, when the combined forces of the Imperial Navy and 2 regiments of Fresh Guard managed to establish orbital superiority and drive the Orks back from the walls, we walked out through Gate 17 to survey the battlefield. The ground was so thick with dead Orks that you could not see the earth beneath them. The stench was beyond description. Carrion birds, ugly black things that seemed to exist on every world in the Imperium, were so gorged on dead greenskin that they could barely fly, hopping between corpses like obscene feathered parasites. Captain Heshren of 3rd Company met us at the gate, and he looked at us, at our battered armor and our depleted ammunition stocks and the scars that even our enhanced bodies had not yet finished healing. And he said, "You held. Just that. You held." And Vosk, who had barely spoken 100 words in 4 months of constant combat, replied, "We are Salamanders. We hold." I kept the obsidian tablets. I keep them all. They are in a chest in my cell on Prometheus, Nocturne's moon, where our fortress monastery stands above the orbital forges. Every tablet from every campaign, carved with every name I could learn. The chest grows heavier each year, but it has not yet outgrown its purpose. The chaplains have noticed my practice, and some of them have commented on it, not with disapproval, but with a kind of recognition. One of them, Igniax Brenneth Sulhar, told me that what I do is a form of prayer, that by carving the names of the dead into the volcanic glass of our homeworld, I am performing the circle of fire in miniature, returning the fallen to the mountain so that the mountain remembers them. I do not know if that is true. I do not carve because I believe it will bring the dead back or send them to some better place. I carve because someone has to, and because the alternative, forgetting, is a betrayal that I am not willing to commit. The Imperium forgets its dead with a speed that borders on obscenity. A guardsman dies, and within a week his bunk has been reassigned and his name has been struck from the muster roll, and his family, if he had one, receives a form letter that does not even spell his name correctly. 1 billion die on a world that falls, and the administratum records it as a logistics adjustment. I refuse to participate in that erasure. Every name I carve is a small act of defiance against the machinery of forgetting, and if that is prayer, then I suppose I am the most devout brother in the chapter, though I would never claim such a thing. The campaign on Korveth Tertius taught me what kind of war we were fighting in this new era. The Great Rift had changed everything. The enemies were the same, Orks and chaos, and the endless parade of horrors that the galaxy produces. But the scale of suffering had multiplied beyond anything the Imperium had known since the heresy itself. Worlds that had been stable for millennia were suddenly isolated, cut off, left to fend for themselves against threats they had never been equipped to face. And we, the Adeptus Astartes, were supposed to be the answer. The Emperor's angels of death descending from the sky to save the faithful. But there were not enough of us. There are never enough of us. The Salamanders field 7 companies at full strength, roughly 700 battle brothers, and we are expected to defend a domain that spans hundreds of light years. The mathematics of it are brutal and inescapable. For every world we save, 10 more burn. For every city we shield, a continent dies undefended. This is the weight that every Salamander carries. Not the weight of our armor, not the weight of our weapons, but the weight of knowing that somewhere, right now, at this very moment, people are dying who we could have saved if only we had been in the right place at the right time. Other chapters do not feel this. The Ultramarines process it as a strategic calculation. The Iron Hands dismiss it as irrelevant sentimentality. But we feel it, every one of us, because Vulkan made us this way, because the Promethean Creed insists that we remain human enough to feel the cost of every failure. It is our greatest strength and our deepest wound, and they are the same thing. After Korveth Tertius, 3rd Company redeployed twice in rapid succession, first to the fortress world of Gurenthal to break a chaos warband that had seized the orbital defense platforms, and then to the mining colony of Strech Quintus, where a Tyrannid vanguard organism had been detected in the deep shafts. Both campaigns were sharp, violent, and relatively brief. Surgical strikes of the kind the Adeptus Astartes excel at, dropping from orbit, eliminating the threat, and extracting before the enemy can consolidate a response. I carved more names after each one, more tablets for the chest, but these were simpler engagements. Wars that fit neatly into the heroic narratives the ecclesiarchy likes to tell about us. Drop from the sky, kill the enemy, save the people, return to the stars. Clean, simple, almost beautiful in its clarity. The next deployment was none of those things. The world was called Drathmere, and on paper it was classified as an agri-world, which, in the Imperium's lexicon, is supposed to conjure images of golden fields and bountiful harvests feeding the teeming billions of neighboring hive worlds. The reality of Drathmere was rather different. It was a poisoned land of dust storms and chemical-scorched plains, its native ecosystem long since annihilated by 10,000 years of industrial monoculture. The atmosphere was thick with particulate matter that turned the sky a permanent yellowish-brown, and the workers who toiled in the vast grain processing complexes wore respirators not as a precaution, but as a basic requirement for survival. The population was small by imperial standards, perhaps 800,000, most of them bonded laborers who had never left the planet and never would. Their entire existence was devoted to growing, harvesting, and processing a single strain of nutrient grain that was shipped off-world to feed the hive populations of a dozen neighboring systems. They lived in fortified agricultural compounds scattered across the plains, squat, ugly structures built to withstand the dust storms and the occasional raid from whatever predatory fauna had managed to survive the ecological devastation. Life on Drathmere was grinding, thankless, and short. But it was life, and the people who lived it deserved the same protection as any citizen of the Imperium. The Orks had arrived 6 months before we did, a significant warband under a war boss called Grisnak Irontif, a brute of unusual cunning who had somehow navigated the warp storms of the Great Rift with a fleet of looted transports and crash-landed his forces across Drathmere's primary agricultural continent. The warband was not large enough, perhaps 15 to 20,000 greenskins, but it was more than sufficient to overwhelm a world whose defense consisted of a single PDF regiment and a handful of automated gun emplacements. By the time the distress signal reached Imperial Command, Grisnak had already overrun half the agricultural compounds and was using the captured grain stores to fuel his warband's expansion, because orcs grow larger and more aggressive when well fed, and there was a lot of grain on Drathmere. Third Company was not the only Astartes force assigned to the liberation of Drathmere. A demi-company of the Marines Malevolent had also been tasked with the operation, and when I heard that name in the briefing, I saw Sergeant Vosk's jaw tighten, and the tightening told me everything I needed to know about our new allies. The Marines Malevolent are a chapter whose reputation precedes them like the bow wave of a warship, and the reputation is not good. They are effective fighters. No one disputes that. They prosecute the Emperor's wars with a ferocity that borders on zealotry, and their battle record is, on purely tactical terms, exemplary. But they fight with a disregard for collateral damage that makes other chapters uncomfortable and makes Salamanders physically angry. They had bombarded refugee camps on Armageddon. They had withheld aid from civilian populations as a matter of policy. They treated the people they were supposed to protect as acceptable losses, expendable resources to be spent in pursuit of military objectives. For us, for Salamanders, this is not merely a tactical disagreement. It is a violation of everything we stand for. The Promethean Creed demands the protection of the innocent. The Marines Malevolent do not appear to have a creed that demands anything beyond victory. Captain Dulth briefed us on the operational plan. Third Company would focus on securing and evacuating the remaining agricultural compounds where civilian populations were holding out. The Marines Malevolent, under a captain named Kelvren Dras, would handle the direct assault on Grisnak's primary encampment. It was a sensible division of labor that kept the two forces largely separate, and I suspect Captain Dulth designed it specifically to minimize the chances of an inter-chapter incident. It did not work. The trouble began at Agricultural Compound Theta-7, one of the largest surviving settlements on the planet. Approximately 12,000 civilians were sheltering there, protected by a handful of PDF troopers and the compound's perimeter walls, which had been designed to keep out dust storms and wild animals, not orc war parties. When we arrived, the compound was under active assault. Grisnak had sent a raiding force of several hundred orcs to seize the compound's grain stores, and the defenders were minutes from being overrun. We deployed directly into the compound's central yard via Thunderhawk, Vosk's squad, and two others, and we hit the orcs from behind while they were still trying to batter down the main gate. The fighting was close and ugly, the kind of room-to-room, wall-to-wall violence that favors flamers and combat knives over precision shooting. Torvaan was in his element, his flamer turning every corridor and doorway into a kill zone, and I fought beside him with bolter and blade, the two of us moving in a synchrony that had been forged in the fires of Korveth Tertius and tempered by 2 campaigns since. We cleared the compound in 4 hours. The orcs died hard, as orcs always do, but they died. When it was over, we had lost no brothers, though Brother Ilrieth had taken a chop-a-blow to the left pauldron that had carved a gouge deep enough to expose the ceramite beneath the green lacquer. The civilian casualties were heavier, 208 dead, mostly from the initial orc assault before we arrived. I learned their names later. I carved them that night. The problem was what came next. The surviving civilians needed evacuation. The compound was indefensible in the long term, and Grisnak would send a larger force once he realized his raiding party had been destroyed. Captain Dulth authorized an evacuation convoy, a column of civilian transport vehicles escorted by our rhinos, moving south toward the planetary capital where the main Imperial defense line was being established. It would be a dangerous journey across open ground, exposed to orc raiders, but it was the only viable option. The alternative was leaving 12,000 people in a compound that would fall within days. The convoy set out at dawn. I was in the rear guard with Vosk's squad, our rhino rolling at walking pace behind the last of the civilian transports. A battered cargo hauler packed with families who had crammed themselves in so tightly that the vehicle's suspension was bottoming out over every rut in the road. The dust was terrible, a brown fog that reduced visibility to 50 meters and coated everything in a fine grit that worked its way into the joints of my armor. The civilians were quiet, a fragile silence born of exhaustion and fear, and the dim awareness that the open road offers no shelter if the enemy comes. The enemy came at midday. A mob of Ork vehicles, crude war bikes and trucks bristling with guns, hit the convoy's left flank in a screaming rush of engines and gunfire. It was a typical Ork hit-and-run attack, designed more to cause chaos than to achieve any specific objective. But against a convoy of unarmed civilian vehicles, it was devastating. The first volley of fire raked across the column, and I watched a transport 3 vehicles ahead of us take a rock heat hit that blew out its rear axle and sent it skidding sideways across the road. People spilled from the wreckage, some of them on fire, others crawling with injuries that would have killed them if not treated within minutes. I was out of the rhino before Vosk gave the order, "Bolt her up," putting rounds into the lead warbike as it screamed past at 70 kilometers per hour. The rider's head exploded and the bike veered into a ditch, cartwheeling end over end in a shower of sparks and scrap metal. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. We destroyed 9 Ork vehicles and killed approximately 40 greenskins, but the convoy had taken damage. 3 transports were disabled, and the casualties among the civilians were significant. We were in the process of redistributing the survivors among the remaining vehicles when the Marines Malevolent arrived. They came from the north in a column of Predator tanks and Razorbacks, the yellow and black of their livery garish against the brown dust of Drathmere. Captain Drass's vehicle pulled up alongside the convoy, and Drass himself emerged from the top hatch, a tall figure in battered power armor, with a face that seemed to have been assembled from spare parts of contempt and impatience. He surveyed the scene, the burning transports, the wounded civilians, our brothers working alongside guard medics to stabilize the injured, and his lip curled. "You are wasting time," he said over the open Vox channel, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The Ork encampment is 40 kilometers northeast. My scouts report that Grisnak is marshalling his forces for a major push. Every minute you spend nursemaiding these workers is a minute the greenskin uses to strengthen his position." Captain Dolth's response was measured, which for a salamander in that moment was an act of extraordinary restraint. "These people are Imperial citizens. They are under our protection." "They are a liability," Drass said. "Leave them. The PDF can collect them later. If there is a later." I was close enough to hear this exchange directly, not through the Vox, but through the air, the 2 captains standing 20 meters apart with the burning wreck of a civilian transport between them. I could see the muscles in Dolth's jaw working beneath his ebon skin, the ember of his eyes brightening with a fury that he was holding on a very short leash. Torvaan was beside me, and I heard him whisper a word in Nocturnian that does not translate well into Gothic, but roughly means one who has forgotten the forge, which among salamanders is an insult of considerable weight. "The PDF is dead," Dolth said. "There are 87 troopers remaining on this continent. They cannot collect anyone. These people come with us, or they die." Drass stared at him for a long moment, and then he shrugged, a gesture that managed to convey absolute indifference to the fate of 12,000 human lives. "Your funeral, Drake, and theirs." He dropped back into his hatch, and the Marines Malevolent column rolled past us without stopping. their treads throwing up sheets of dust that settled on the wounded civilians like a burial shroud. It took us another 6 hours to get the convoy moving again. Those 6 hours had a price, and I need you to understand what it was, because this is the arithmetic that the Marines Malevolent will never grasp, and that the Salamanders carry like iron in the blood. While we were redistributing survivors and repairing damaged transports, Grisnak launched his main offensive against the planetary capital. Captain Dulth received the Vox reports in real time. The southern wall breached, the PDF garrison collapsing, the Marines Malevolent driving forward, but leaving their flanks exposed because Dras is fought like a spear, all point and no breadth. Dulth could have ordered us to abandon the convoy, to leave the 12,000 on the road, and rush to reinforce the capital's defenses. The tactically correct choice was obvious. It was the same choice Dras would have made without a second's hesitation. Dulth looked at the convoy, at the families sitting in the dust, waiting to move, at the wounded we had spent hours stabilizing, and he said, "We finish what we started." 2 brothers of Squad Melkari, who had been dispatched ahead as outriders, were killed in the first hours of the siege because our forces were not there to hold the southern approach. Brother Threvan Kelt and Brother Ocean Har. I learned their names that night. I carved them. They died because we chose to protect a convoy of workers and their families, because our captain decided that abandoning the people behind us was a line the Salamanders would not cross. I agreed with him. I still agree with him. I will carry the weight of that agreement for the rest of my life. Compassion is not free. It is not clean. It costs blood, sometimes the blood of people you love, and if you are not willing to pay that price, then your compassion is performance, not principle. We arrived at the capital 8 hours after the siege had begun. The Marines Malevolent had already punched through the Ork lines in a spearhead assault that was tactically brilliant and humanly monstrous. Dras had driven his armored column through a settlement called Colvin's Rest, a workers' habitation block on the outskirts of the capital, and he had not bothered to evacuate it first. The settlement was a ruin of collapsed buildings and burning rubble, and the bodies in the wreckage were not all Orks. The Marines Malevolent had used the settlement as a corridor, blasting through buildings rather than going around them, and the civilian casualties were in the hundreds. I was the one who found the girl. She was perhaps 8 years old, pinned under a section of fallen wall, her legs crushed, her face gray with dust and shock. She was alive. A slab of flooring had caught on the rubble above her and formed a pocket of space that had kept the full weight from killing her outright. I lifted the wall section off her, careful of the way the surrounding debris shifted, and when she looked up at me, at this coal-black giant in blood-streaked green armor pulling her from the ruins, she did not ask if I was a monster. She asked something worse. She asked, "Why did the soldiers do this?" And I had no answer, because the soldiers she meant were not Orks. The Orks had been outside the walls. The soldiers who had demolished her home and killed her family and crushed her legs had been Astartes, warriors of the Emperor, the same as me. I carried her to the Medici station in my arms, and she weighed almost nothing, and the distance between the rubble and the triage tent was perhaps 200 meters. And it was the longest walk I have ever taken. On Korveth Tertius, a boy had asked me if I was a monster, and I had told him I was his shield. On Drathmere, a girl asked me why the shields had turned against her, and I said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The Battle of Drathmere lasted another 3 weeks. The siege ground on longer than it needed to, because Dras had spent his momentum punching through Colvin's Rest instead of enveloping the Ork positions, which meant the Greenskins had time to regroup and dig in among the ruins. In the end, Grisnak Iron Teef was killed by Brother Torvaan Gesht. who walked into the war boss's command bunker with nothing but his flamer and a pair of melter charges, clamped them to the load-bearing columns, and walked out again through the back wall because the front wall no longer existed. It was suicidally brave, the sort of act that earns a salamander a new honor scar and a strongly worded reprimand from the chaplains, and Torvaan received both with equal grace. The Ork warband collapsed without its leader, as Ork warbands tend to do, fragmenting into smaller mobs that the Guard could handle. The reckoning with the Marines Malevolent came in orbit, aboard the strike cruiser Vulkan's Spite. Captain Dulth and Captain Drass met in the command strategium, and the conversation was brief and volcanic. I was not present, but Vosk was, standing behind Dulth as his honor guard, and he told me afterward that Dulth had laid out, in precise and devastating detail, the civilian casualties caused by Drass's assault through Kolvin's Rest, and that he had also laid out the two brothers of Squad Melkuri, who had died on the southern wall because 3rd Company had been defending a civilian convoy that the Marines Malevolent had refused to assist. Dulth told Drass that the blood of Celt and Har was shared between them, that Drass's contempt for the convoy was as much a cause of their deaths as the Ork axes that had killed them. Drass had responded with a strategic justification that was logically sound and morally bankrupt, arguing that the speed of his advance had saved more lives overall by breaking the siege faster. Dulth had told him that the Salamanders would not serve alongside the Marines Malevolent again unless their command could demonstrate a commitment to minimizing civilian casualties. Drass had laughed, actually laughed, and then Dulth had said something in Nocturnian that Vosk refused to translate for me, but which made the temperature in the room drop by several degrees despite the presence of 2 salamanders. The chapters parted ways. There was no formal censure, no inquisitorial intervention, no grand judicial proceeding. There never is. The Adeptus Astartes police themselves, which is another way of saying that grievances between chapters simmer and fester, and occasionally erupt into violence that the Imperium pretends does not happen. I carved the names of the dead from Kolvin's Rest onto a tablet of particularly dark obsidian, so dark it was almost true black, and I marked it differently from my others, with a small symbol at the bottom that means killed by friendly hands. It is the only tablet in my collection that carries that mark, and it is the one I think about most often. Drathmere taught me something that Korveth Tertius had not. On Korveth, the enemy was clear, Orks at the gates, civilians behind the walls, our duty as obvious as the brand on my chest. But Drathmere showed me that the threat to the Emperor's people does not always come from outside. Sometimes the greatest danger to the Imperium's citizens is the Imperium itself, its own institutions, its own warriors, its own absolute conviction that the mission justifies any cost. The Marines Malevolent are not heretics. They are not traitors. They serve the Emperor as faithfully as we do, and that is what makes them terrifying. Because if loyal servants of the throne can look at the broken body of a civilian and feel nothing, then what does loyalty even mean? After Drathmere, we returned to Nocturne for resupply and ritual. I spent the time in the forges of Hesiod, working metal as I had been taught as a boy, before the gene seed and the surgeries and the black carapace had turned me into something more and less than human. I forged a new combat blade during that period of rest, a broad-bladed weapon in the Nocturnian style, with a hilt wrapped in drake leather and a single word etched into the flat of the blade in the old script. The word was Heshren, which, in the Hesiod dialect, means that which shields. It was not a masterwork. I am not a master smith, but it was mine, made by my own hands in the fires of my home city. And there is a bond between a warrior and a weapon he has forged himself that no armory-issued blade can ever match. When I hold Heshren, I feel the heat of the forge in the metal, the memory of the hammer blows, the intention I put into every fold and quench. It is a part of me as no factory-stamped bolter, for all its lethality, can ever be. Torvaan forged something too during that rest period. A pendant small enough to fit in his palm, shaped like a drake's claw gripping a sphere of obsidian. He gave it to me on the last night before our redeployment, and when I asked what it was for, he said, "So you remember that you are not alone in this. Whatever comes next, whatever the galaxy throws at us, we walk into it together. Forge brothers." I took the pendant, and I have worn it under my gorget ever since, a small weight against my chest that sits right next to the first honor scar, the one the Igniax burned into me on the day I became a Salamander. Torvaan was not one for grand gestures. He was a practical man, a good fighter, steady and reliable in the way that a well-made tool is reliable. The pendant was the most personal thing he had ever given anyone, and I understood the weight of it. Forge brothers, bound by fire and iron, and the shared experience of having walked through hell and come out the other side still caring about what happened to the people we left behind. What came next would test that bond to its breaking point and beyond. The world was called Ghelspar, and it was beautiful. I do not use that word lightly. In 63 years of service, I have set foot on hundreds of worlds, and most of them have been ugly in one way or another, either by nature or by the hand of man, or by the ravages of war. But Ghelspar was genuinely beautiful, a temperate world of deep blue oceans and green continents, with cities that rose in white spires along its coastlines and forests that stretched unbroken across its mountain ranges. The population was small, perhaps 300 million, prosperous by imperial standards, and the planet served as a way station and resupply point for naval vessels moving through the Keldrathi Reach. It was, by any measure, a good place to live, the kind of world that made you understand why the Emperor had launched the Great Crusade in the first place, to reclaim places like this for humanity. The Drukari came on a moonless night. That is how they always come, in darkness, in silence, through the thin places where real space brushes against the webway. Their raiding fleet materialized in Gelspar's upper atmosphere without warning, bypassing the orbital defense network entirely, a feat that should have been impossible, but which the Dark Eldar accomplish with the same contemptuous ease with which a human steps over a puddle. One moment, the skies above the coastal city of Harenth were clear. The next, they were full of Drukhari Ravager gunships and venom transports, and the screaming had begun. I need you to understand something about the Drukhari, about the Aeldari who call themselves the Dark Kin, because what I am about to describe will make no sense without context. They are not like Orks, who fight because fighting is their nature. They are not like the forces of chaos, who are driven by the whims of mad gods. The Drukhari raid and kill and torture because they must, because their depraved souls are being slowly consumed by the chaos god Slaanesh. And the only way to stave off that consumption is to feed on the suffering of others. Pain sustains them. Agony is their currency. They take captives not because they need slaves, though they use them, but because a human being in the hands of a Drukhari Haemonculus can be kept alive and suffering for decades, centuries even, their pain drawn out and refined and distilled into something that the Dark Kin drink like fine wine. Every scream is a sip of immortality. Every broken bone is a day added to their wretched existence. They are parasites who feed on anguish, and they have elevated cruelty to an art form that would make a demon of Slaanesh nod in grudging appreciation. For the Salamanders, the hatred of the Drukhari is not just doctrinal. It is personal. It is ancestral. Before the Emperor found Vulkan, before the Great Crusade, the Drukhari raided Nocturne. They came during the time of trial, when the planet's volcanic fury was at its peak, and the people of the sanctuary cities were at their most vulnerable, and they took slaves by the thousands. Vulkan himself fought the Dark Kin as a boy, driving them from his world with nothing but courage and the weapons he had forged in his own hearth. That memory lives in us. It is part of the genetic inheritance that the gene seed carries, a hatred so deep it might as well be written into our blood. When a salamander faces a Drukhari, the anger that rises is not rational, it is not calculated. It is volcanic, a thing of magma and tectonic pressure, and it demands release. We had been en route to another deployment when the distress call from Ghelspar reached us. Captain Dulth diverted immediately, pushing the strike cruiser's engines to dangerous output levels to shave hours off the transit time. When we dropped from the warp above Ghelspar, the Drukhari fleet was already withdrawing, their holds full of captives, their ships sliding back toward the webway portals that hung in space like tears in a dark curtain. We caught them in the gap between real space and the webway, our Thunderhawks launching before the strike cruiser had even established a stable orbit. The Drukhari had not expected pursuit. They had expected the same thing they always expect, that they would take what they wanted and vanish before the Imperium's ponderous military machine could respond. They were wrong. They had forgotten, or perhaps they had never known, that the Salamanders do not respond on the Imperium's timeline. We respond on our own. The boarding action was the most violent engagement I had experienced to that point. We breached 3 Drukhari transport vessels simultaneously, cutting through their hulls with melter charges and pouring into the alien corridors with flamers blazing. The interior of a Drukhari ship is a nightmare given architecture, all sharp angles and bladed surfaces, the walls decorated with what I can only describe as art made from human suffering. Flayed skin stretched and preserved, bones arranged in patterns that seem to writhe in the flickering light of bioluminescent lamps. The air itself was wrong, thick with a sweet, cloying scent that the ship's systems pumped through the ventilation, a psychoactive compound designed to heighten fear and pain in captive humans. My autosenses filtered it out, but I could smell it beneath the chemical overlay of my rebreather, a ghost of the horror that the prisoners in the ship's holds were experiencing. We fought through Kabbalite warriors and witch cultists, the former armed with splinter weapons that fired clouds of needle-thin crystalline shards laced with neurotoxins, finding the seams and joints of our ceramite, the latter moving with a speed and grace that made them almost impossible to track. I lost Brother Kelvron Ost in those corridors, taken down by a witch who dropped from the ceiling like a spider and drove a poisoned blade through the gap between his helm and his gorget. Ost died badly, the toxin doing things to his nervous system that his enhanced physiology could not counter, and by the time I reached him, his body had contorted into a shape that no human skeleton should be capable of achieving. I killed the witch with Heshren, my forged blade punching through her chest and pinning her to the wall, and I held her there and watched the light leave her eyes, and I felt nothing except a cold satisfaction that one more of these parasites would never hurt anyone again. We found the captives in the lower holds, 3,000 people from Harinth, crammed into cages that had been designed to maximize discomfort, every surface lined with microbarbs that drew blood with every movement, the cages stacked so that the fluids from the upper tiers dripped down onto the people below. Some of the captives had already been processed by the Haemonculi, their bodies altered in ways that I will not describe because some things do not deserve the permanence of words. The survivors looked at us with eyes that had seen too much, eyes that had crossed a threshold of suffering beyond which normal human emotions cannot function. They did not cheer when we opened the cages. They did not cry. They simply stood or sat or lay where they were, waiting for whatever came next with the blank patience of creatures who have learned that hope is just another kind of pain. Torvaan was the one who went in first. He walked into that hold and he stopped, and he stood there for a long moment, and then he began, very carefully, very gently, to help people out of the cages. He moved with a tenderness that seemed impossible for a being of his size and lethality, lifting children with hands that had burned orc war bosses alive hours before, supporting wounded adults with arms that could crush ceramite. I joined him, and together we worked through the hold, cage by cage, person by person. Some of the captives flinched from our touch. Some could not stand. Some were so damaged that we could only make them comfortable and mark them for the medici teams that would follow. I lifted a girl from a cage, perhaps 6 years old, and she weighed so little that I almost dropped her from the shock of it because I had expected the weight of a child and instead felt almost nothing. She had been in those cages for days, maybe longer. Her fingers were bloody from the microbarbs, and she was shaking with a constant, fine tremor that spoke of dehydration and terror. As I carried her into the corridor where our brothers had set up a triage area, I thought about the Drukari who had built that cage, not the Kabbalite who had captured her, the one who had designed the microbarbs, the one who had calculated the exact spacing of the wire so that every movement would draw blood but never enough to kill, because dead captives do not suffer, and it is suffering that the dark kin feed on. Someone had sat down and engineered that cage with the same care and precision I would apply to forging a blade. The thing they had crafted was a machine for harvesting pain from children. I looked at that girl in my arms, and I understood something about the Xenos that no amount of doctrine or catechism could have taught me. The alien does not see a child. The alien sees raw material, a resource to be processed, a thing whose capacity for suffering is a commodity to be extracted. Every Xenos species I have encountered treats humanity this way, as fuel, as food, as sport, as an inconvenience to be managed. The Drukari are simply more honest about it than the rest. It was then that Torvaan spotted a group of Kabbalite warriors, retreating deeper into the ship, dragging additional captives with them toward what we believed was a secondary hold. He voxed me. "Urdhen, they are taking more of them. I can cut them off through the lower corridor." I looked at the hold around me, at the hundreds of people still in the cages, at the girl I had just set down who was clinging to my gauntlet with both hands and would not let go. Sergeant Vosk was on the far side of the hold, coordinating the extraction. We were stretched thin already. If I went with Torvaan, the rescue operation would slow. People in the cages would wait longer, and in their condition, longer meant some of them would Go, I told him. I will stay with the captives. Torvaan went. He disappeared into the arterial corridor that ran along the ship's spine, his flamer's pilot light a small orange point in the dark that grew smaller and then vanished entirely, and the hold seemed emptier without him, despite the 3,000 people in it. I went back to the cages. I opened them one by one. I carried people out. And for 40 minutes, while my forge brother was alone in the guts of a Drukhari warship, I chose the captives over him. When Torvaan emerged, he was battered, his armor scored with splinter impacts and toxin burns, and he was alone. The Kabbalite warriors had been killed, but the captives they had been dragging were gone, pulled through a webway aperture that had closed behind them. Torvaan had not been fast enough. He had a wound on his neck, a small puncture below the ear, that he dismissed as a glancing hit from a splinter round. The apothecary cleaned and sealed it, and Torvaan waved off any further examination, saying he was fine, that there were captives who needed attention more than he did. That was pure Torvaan, always deflecting concern for himself toward others. I looked at the wound and I felt a flicker of something, not concern exactly, but a whisper of unease that I immediately buried, because there was work to do and people to save. I chose not to think about it. I chose the captives again over the nagging feeling in my gut that something was wrong with my forge brother. I would make that choice over and over in the months that followed, always finding a reason to look away, to explain it, to believe that Torvaan was fine, because believing otherwise meant confronting a horror I was not ready for. That was the Drukhari's real victory on Ghelspar. Not the captives they took, though that was horror enough. It was the weapon they planted in my brother while I was busy being a hero, a weapon I could have prevented if I had gone with him, if I had chosen differently in that one moment in the hold. I will never know if that is true. It does not stop me from believing it. We extracted the surviving captives and returned them to Ghelspar's surface. Of the 3,000 taken, we recovered 2,112. The rest had either died in the holds or been taken deeper into the Drukhari fleet before we could reach them, carried into the webway and lost to us forever. I carved their names, every one of the 888 we could not save, onto 7 tablets of pale Nocturnian ash stone, the soft gray rock that forms in the cooled flows above the sanctuary cities. Because, in our tradition, the color of mourning is not black, but the pale gray of volcanic ash. Those tablets sit in a separate section of my chest, apart from the others, and I handle them with particular care. I have heard the arguments for pragmatism regarding the Xenos. I have heard that the Aldari craft worlds are different from the Drukhari, that the Tau offer alliance, that some alien species pose no threat. My answer to every one of those arguments is the same. Come with me to that lower hold, stand where I stood, lift a child with bloody fingers out of a cage that was designed to hurt her. Watch her flinch from your hands because the last hands that touched her were alien, and the touch was agony. And then tell me about alliance. Tell me about pragmatism. Tell me about exceptions. You will not be able to because the words will turn to ash in your mouth, and the only thing you will want to do is what I wanted to do in that hold, which is to burn every Xenos vessel in the void until there is nothing left but atoms and silence. The alien is the antithesis of everything we fight to protect. Our response to that is, and must always be, absolute. 17 months after Ghelspar, we were deployed to a world called Vellanoch, and it was there that everything I believed about myself and my duty was broken and remade in a shape unfamiliar to me. Vellanoch was a civilized world in the Hadrathine subsector, a modest planet of 40 million people that served primarily as an administrative hub for the surrounding systems. It was not strategically vital. It was not a fortress world or a forge world or an agri-world of critical importance. It was simply a place where people lived and worked and raised their families under the Aquila of the Imperium. A quiet world in a galaxy that had very little quiet left. The distress call reported a chaos cult uprising in the planet's northern hemisphere, a small but violent insurrection that the local PDF had been unable to contain. Standard operating procedure. We had dealt with cult uprisings on a dozen worlds. Third Company deployed expecting a routine purge and pacify operation, a mission that would take weeks rather than months, and that would be remembered, if at all, as a footnote in the chapter's campaign records. We were wrong. We were catastrophically, devastatingly wrong, and the mistake we made was born not from incompetence or carelessness, but from the very quality that defines us as salamanders. Our compassion. The situation on the ground was more complex than the initial reports had suggested. The cult uprising in the north had triggered a massive refugee crisis, with hundreds of thousands of people fleeing south toward the planetary capital of Vellanoch Prime. By the time we arrived, the refugee columns stretched for dozens of kilometers along the major highways, an endless river of humanity carrying whatever they could on their backs, pushing carts loaded with children and possessions, moving with the desperate, shuffling gait of people who have been walking for days without adequate food or water. The cult's forces had been pushing south behind them, burning settlements and executing anyone who refused to join their cause, which gave the refugees every reason to keep moving and no reason to stop. Captain Dulth established our defensive perimeter around Vellanoch Prime and immediately began organizing the intake of refugees. This was standard Salamander doctrine. Protect the civilians first, establish safe zones, provide food, water, medical care, then deal with the military threat. It was what we did. It was who we were. I was assigned to the refugee processing points on the northern approach, working alongside guard units and local administratum officials to manage the flow of people into the city. It was exhausting, chaotic work. Nothing like combat, but draining in its own way. The constant stream of frightened faces, the children crying, the elderly collapsing from exhaustion, the wounded stumbling in with injuries that told stories of the violence they had fled. An inquisitor arrived on the fourth day. Her name was Urdhen Velk, an Ordo Xenos operative with a retinue of hardened acolytes and a Death Watch kill team on permanent attachment. She demanded an immediate meeting with Captain Dulth, and when they emerged from the strategium an hour later, Dulth's face was carved from stone, and Vane's eyes were burning with an intensity that I recognized as the particular madness of someone who has seen something terrible and knows that worse is coming. Dulth assembled the company. "The Inquisitor believes that the cult uprising is a cover," he said. "She has evidence that the population of Velanoch's northern hemisphere has been compromised by a Genestealer infestation. The refugees are not fleeing the cult. They are the cult. The entire population displacement has been engineered to move the infected population into the uninfected southern hemisphere, into the capital, into our defensive perimeter." The silence that followed was absolute. I looked at the refugee columns streaming through our checkpoints, at the thousands of people we had been feeding and sheltering and protecting for 4 days. And the ground shifted under my feet, and tectonics had nothing to do with it. These people, the woman I had given water to that morning, the old man whose wounded leg I had helped a Mediki dress, the children playing in the temporary shelters we had established, infected, compromised, carriers of a Xenos parasite that could, if allowed to spread, consume this world and every world it touched. "What is the evidence?" I heard myself ask, and Captain Dulth looked at me, and in his eyes I saw a pain that I had never seen in a salamander before, the pain of a man who has been told that his greatest virtue is also his greatest weapon turned against him. The Inquisitor's evidence was thorough and undeniable. Her Death Watch team had intercepted communications from a Genestealer Patriarch operating in the northern mountains, directing the cult uprising specifically to trigger the refugee crisis. The infected population, generations of subtle genetic compromise that left no visible signs in the early stages, had been seeded throughout the civilian columns. Biological samples taken covertly from refugees at our own checkpoints had shown the markers. Not all of them were infected, perhaps not even a majority, but enough. More than enough. The Patriarch had weaponized our compassion, had studied the Salamanders, had understood that a chapter that defines itself by the protection of the innocent could be manipulated through that very instinct. It had turned our shield into a gate and opened it wide. Inquisitor Vane's recommendation was immediate and total quarantine of the refugee population, with mass screening and, where necessary, mass liquidation of infected individuals. Dulth argued for a more measured approach, targeted screening using the Death Watch's specialized equipment, isolation of confirmed infected, protection of the clean population. Vane told him there was no time. The infection was generational. Some carriers showed no symptoms and would never show symptoms, but their children, or their children's children, would be born with the gene's stealer's mark. The only way to be certain was to test every single person, and even then the tests were not perfectly reliable. The only truly safe option was exterminatus. I will not describe the days that followed in detail. Some things are too raw for narrative, too close to the bone. What I will tell you is this. We did not authorize exterminatus. Captain Dulth refused, and when Vane threatened to go over his head, he told her that the Salamanders would physically prevent any vessel from achieving bombardment position over the planet. This was not an idle threat. Our strike cruiser had the firepower to enforce it, and Dulth would have done it. He would have fired on an Imperial vessel to protect the people of Vellanoch, and every brother in Third Company would have stood behind him. Instead, we screened, we tested, we isolated, and we discovered that the infection was far worse than even Vane had estimated. Nearly 40% of the refugee population carried Genestealer markers. 40%. Of the 200,000 people we had welcomed into our defensive perimeter, approximately 80,000 were compromised. Many of them did not know it. Many of them were good people, loyal Imperial citizens, who had no idea that something alien lived in their blood, planted there by ancestors who had been victimized generations ago. They were victims twice over, first of the Genestealer's original predation, and now of the necessity of its containment. The infected were separated and placed in isolation camps. The uninfected were relocated to secure zones. The process was orderly, which somehow made it worse, because orderly meant efficient, and efficient meant that we processed thousands of people per day, sorting them like grain on a threshing floor, the clean from the contaminated. And I kept thinking about Drathmere, about the agricultural compounds, about how this was not so different, really, from what the Imperium does to its grain worlds, extracting what is useful and discarding the rest. I need to tell you about the woman. I need to tell you because it is the part of Vellanoch that belongs to me, not to Dulth's grand stand against exterminatus or the Inquisitor's cold calculus, but to me, Urdhen Velk, the brother who gave water to refugees. Her name was Mirath. I had met her on the second day at the northern processing point when she stumbled in from the road with a broken ankle and a boy of about 3 clinging to her neck. I helped the medici set her ankle and I gave her water, and I found them a place in one of the sheltered areas we had established in a requisitioned Skalam building. She thanked me. She called me Lord, which civilians sometimes do when they see Astartes, and I told her my name, which I should not have done, because when you give someone your name, they become real to you in a way that a face in a crowd cannot be, and on Vellanoch, being real was going to be a problem. On the 7th day, the test results for Sholam Block 3 came back. Merath was on the list, positive for second-generation markers. Her boy, too. She did not know. She had never known. Her grandmother's grandmother had been compromised, and the taint had been passed down through bloodlines so diluted that no outward sign remained. Only the genetic architecture waiting in her cells, like a dormant seed that might bloom in her grandchildren, or her grandchildren's grandchildren. She was no more responsible for the thing in her blood than she was for the color of her eyes, and I was the one who had to tell her. I went to the Skolam myself. I could have sent a guard sergeant. I could have delegated it the way we delegated 1,000 other notifications that day, names on a list, processing numbers on a wrist tag. But I had given her water. I had told her my name, and the Promethean Creed does not allow you to be the shield and then pass off the hard part to someone with less armor. She saw my face, and she knew. Before I said a word, she knew, because she had seen other families escorted from the building that morning, and she had watched them walk toward the isolation zone, and she had understood, on some level, that words had not yet reached what it meant. She held her boy tighter. She looked at me and she said, "You told me we would be safe here." I had, not in those words, not explicitly, but in every cup of water and every bandaged ankle and every reassuring nod, I had made a promise. And the promise was, "I am your shield. I am a salamander. You are safe with me." "You will be safe," I said. And it was not a lie exactly, because the isolation camp was not a death sentence. Not yet, not for everyone. But it was not the safety I had promised either, and she knew it, and I knew she knew it, and between us the word safe collapsed under its own weight like a building with its foundations pulled out. I walked her to the isolation zone. I carried the boy because her ankle was not fully healed, and the distance was long. The boy patted my pauldron with one hand and said, "Green," in the absent way that very young children name colors. I thought about the child on Korveth Tertius, who had asked me if I was a monster, and the girl on Drathmere who had asked me why the soldiers had done this. And now this boy, too young for questions, who simply accepted the green giant carrying him toward a cage because he did not yet understand that the universe was a place where green giants could be both your shield and the thing that locked the gate behind you. At the entrance to the isolation zone, Marath took the boy from me. She did not look at me again. I did not blame her. I do not know what happened to Marath and her son. The isolation camp records were sealed under inquisitorial authority. She may have been cleared after extended screening and released. She may have been among those liquidated when the markers proved to be active rather than dormant. I do not know. And that not knowing is its own kind of wound, because a salamander is supposed to know. A salamander is supposed to stay until the end, to see the thing through, to carry the name to the tablet if the worst happens. I could not do that on Vellanoch, and the failure was not tactical or strategic, but personal, the failure of a man who promised safety to a woman and a child, and could not deliver it. I did not carve names for Vellanoch. The dead deserved remembrance, but on Vellanoch, I could not tell the victims from the threat, and for the first time in my service, I could not name who I was supposed to be mourning. The infected who were liquidated were victims of the Genestealer, not enemies of the Imperium. The civilians who died in the confusion of the quarantine, killed by frightened PDF troopers, or trampled in panics, or simply lost in the system, and left to starve in holding pens that no one checked for 3 days. They were ours. We had brought them into our perimeter. We had promised them safety. And then we had sorted them and caged them, and some of them had died because the machinery of Imperial security, once activated, does not distinguish between malice and misfortune. The Patriarch was found and killed by the Death Watch kill team in a tunnel network beneath the northern mountains. Its death sent a psychic shockwave through the infected population that caused some of them to reveal themselves involuntarily, thrashing and screaming as the hive mind link was severed, their bodies convulsing as the alien neural architecture collapsed. Watching that, watching people I had fed and sheltered suddenly contort and shriek with inhuman voices, was a kind of horror that I had not known existed. Not the horror of violence, which I was long accustomed to, but the horror of uncertainty, of realizing that the line between the innocent and the enemy is not always visible, and that a chapter built on the principle of protecting the innocent is uniquely vulnerable when that line blurs. Vellanoch survived. The planet was placed under inquisitorial quarantine for a decade, its population subject to ongoing screening, its birth records monitored for signs of genetic deviation. Captain Dulth filed his report with the chapter command, and I do not know what it said, but I know that he was different afterward, quieter, more cautious, slower to commit to the unilateral humanitarian actions that had always been the Salamander's hallmark. The Patriarch had hurt us, as no enemy had managed before. It had not killed us. It had not defeated us. It had done something worse. It had made us doubt ourselves. I thought about it for a long time in the forge and on watch, and in the quiet hours of transit. I thought about the old man whose wounded leg I had helped a Mediki dress on the 4th day. He had been clean. The tests confirmed it later. But what if he had not been? Would my compassion then have been a weapon? Would my mercy have been a vector? The answer is yes. And also no, because the Promethean Creed does not say, protect the innocent, only when it is safe to do so. It says the fire will test you. Vellanoch was the hottest fire I had walked through, and the lesson I took from it was not that compassion is weakness, but that compassion in a hostile universe is the most dangerous and necessary form of strength. The Genestealer Patriarch had tried to weaponize our mercy. It had succeeded, partially, but it had also revealed something about us that I had not fully appreciated before. We could have burned that refugee column. Dulth could have ordered it, and the Inquisitor would have backed him, and the Imperium would have called it righteous. We would have been safe, we would have been efficient, and we would have been no different from the Marines Malevolent. We chose the harder path. We always do. That is what it means to be a Salamander. It began with small things, so small that I did not notice them at first, or rather I noticed them and dismissed them, because the alternative was to notice them and think about what they meant, and I was not ready for that. Not after Vellanoch, not when there was no ground left in me to absorb another quake. Torvaan stopped singing in the forge. That was the first thing. For as long as I had known him, Torvaan sang while he worked metal, old Nocturnian forging hymns that his clan mother had taught him in the shadow of Mount Deathfire, songs with no words, just low rhythmic humming that followed the cadence of the hammer. It was as much a part of him as his broad shoulders and his dry wit and his habit of testing a blade's edge against his own thumb before declaring it finished. He had sung through every campaign we shared, through grief and victory and the long, quiet days of transit, and the Forge brothers around him had long since stopped hearing it the same way you stop hearing the wind outside your hab. It was simply there, a constant, a fixed point in the constellation of small certainties that make up a brotherhood forged in fire. He stopped. I could not tell you the exact day. It was not a sudden silence, but a gradual fading, like a coal losing its heat, and by the time I realized that I had not heard Torvaan hum in weeks, the silence had already settled into something that felt permanent. I asked him about it. He looked at me with those ember-orange eyes, and for a fraction of a second, less than a heartbeat, something moved behind them that I did not recognize. Then he smiled and said he had not noticed, and changed the subject to the maintenance schedule for our squad's flamer fuel lines, and I let it go because I wanted to believe him. Then the dreams. Torvaan began speaking in his sleep, which he had never done before, which no Marine should do at all, because the catalepsian node that lets us rest one hemisphere at a time keeps the sleeping half quiet. Our cells aboard the strike cruiser shared a bulkhead, and sound carried through the metal in the quiet hours of the ship-night cycle. I heard him through the wall, muttering in a language that was not Gothic, and was not Nocturnian, and was not any tongue I recognized. The syllables had a liquid, gliding quality, like a blade being drawn slowly across silk, and they made my skin crawl for reasons I could not name. I told myself it was nothing. Battle stress, the after effects of Vellanoch. Every brother processed trauma differently, and Torvaan had been through the same fires I had. A few restless nights meant nothing, except that it was not a few nights, it was every night. And the muttering grew louder, and sometimes it sounded less like sleep talk and more like conversation, as though Torvaan were speaking to someone who was answering him in a voice too quiet for the bulkhead to carry. The physical changes came next. Torvaan had always been meticulous about his war gear, a trait drilled into every salamander from the earliest days of scout training. But his attention to his armor began to take on a quality that went beyond maintenance. He would spend hours polishing surfaces that were already clean, running his fingers along the edges of his pauldrons and greaves with a slow, almost sensual deliberation that was entirely unlike his usual brisk efficiency. I caught him once in the arming chamber, alone, tracing the relief work on his left vambrace with his fingertip, and his expression was one of rapt concentration, as though the engraved flames and anvils on the ceramite were revealing secrets to him that no one else could read. He did not notice me for almost a full minute, which was wrong. A Space Marine's senses are a constant halo of awareness. You do not stand within 3 meters of a brother without him knowing you are there. When he finally looked up, that same flicker crossed his eyes, there and gone, and he said he had been checking for micro-fractures. I began watching him in combat. On our next deployment, a standard enforcement action against a minor heretic warlord on a mining world called Grethis Secundus, I positioned myself where I could observe Torvaan while we fought. What I saw disturbed me to a depth I struggled to articulate. He was still effective. His bolter discipline was sound. His close-quarters work was as lethal as ever. But there was a new quality to his violence, a precision that bordered on artistry, as though the act of killing had become something he was savoring rather than executing. Where before he had fought with the Salamander's characteristic fury, all controlled aggression and thermal bright rage, now there was a coolness to him, a deliberateness that reminded me of something I had seen before. It took me 3 engagements to place the memory, and when I did, the realization hit me like a thunder hammer to the chest. On Ghelspar, in the corridors of the Drukhari transport ship, I had watched a witch fight. She had moved with that same quality, that same lethal elegance, that same sense of a creature that took aesthetic pleasure in the mechanics of death. Torvaan was beginning to fight like a Drukari. I went to Sergeant Vosk. I could have gone to Captain Dulth, or to the apothecary, but Vosk was the one I trusted to hear me without judgment, and judgment was what I feared, because what I was about to say amounted to an accusation against my own forge brother, the closest thing I had to family outside of the chapter itself. Vosk listened in his usual silence, his scarred face betraying nothing. When I finished, he sat for a long time, and then he said 4 words that I will carry with me until the day I die. I have seen it too. Vosk had not spoken because he had been watching and waiting and hoping, the same as me, that he was wrong. He had noticed the silence in the forge. He had noticed the changed fighting style. He had noticed something else, something I had missed. Torvaan's honor scars were changing. The ritual brands that every salamander carries, the marks of trials endured and battles survived, are living records burned into our cold, dark skin by the chapter's chaplains. They do not change. They do not fade. They are permanent by design and by tradition, marks that say this brother has been tested and has endured. But Vosk, who had administered many of Torvaan's brandings himself across the years, had observed that the scar tissue was softening, not dramatically, not in a way that a casual observer would detect, but the ridges of raised flesh were flattening, the patterns blurring at the edges, as though Torvaan's body were slowly rejecting the marks, or as though something inside Torvaan's body were erasing them. Vosk and I went to the apothecary together. Brother Heskel, a century-old veteran who had served with the Salamanders' medical cadre since before either of us had been recruited, examined the data we presented and immediately ordered a full bioscan of Torvaan's physiology. The results came back within the hour, and Heskel's face when he read them was the face of a man looking at something that should not exist. The wound on Torvaan's neck, the small puncture below the ear that he had dismissed as a splinter round on Ghelspar, was not a wound. It was an insertion point. Something had been placed inside Torvaan during those 40 minutes when he was separated from the squad in the Drukhari ship, a device so small and so precisely engineered that it had evaded every standard medical scan conducted in the 17 months since. Heskel called it a neural lace, borrowing a term from the Mechanicus's Xenotech archives, but that name was too clean for what it actually was. It was a parasite, a thing of dark Aeldari bioengineering, grown in the laboratories of a Haemonculus from materials that were part organic, part psychic, and part something that Heskel's instruments could not classify at all. It had threaded itself through Torvaan's nervous system like roots through soil, branching and spreading and interweaving with his neural pathways until it was impossible to tell where the parasite ended and Torvaan began. It was not controlling him, not yet. Not in the crude sense of overriding his will and puppeting his body. What it was doing was slower and far more insidious. It was feeding him sensations, impressions, emotional textures drawn from the Drukhari experience of the universe, a perspective in which pain is beauty and cruelty is craft, and the suffering of others is not something to be prevented, but something to be cultivated, refined, and consumed. It was teaching him, drop by drop, to see the world through dark Eldar eyes. The singing had stopped because the parasite was replacing Torvaan's natural emotional responses with something alien, something that found Nocturnian forge hymns hollow and unsatisfying. The fighting style had changed because the parasite was introducing him to a different relationship with violence, one that prioritized elegance over fury, precision over passion. The honor scars were fading because the parasite was rewriting Torvaan's cellular identity, reshaping him at a biological level to become something that was neither human nor Aeldari, but a hybrid of both. A living trophy for whatever Haemonculus had planted the device. The cruelty of it was exquisite, a word I choose deliberately because the Drukari understand cruelty the way a master artisan understands his craft. They could have killed Torvaan in that ship. They could have taken him prisoner and flayed him alive in their arenas. Instead, they had chosen something far more devastating. They had sent him back to his brothers carrying a weapon that would dismantle him from the inside out, transforming him slowly, imperceptibly from a salamander into something that wore a salamander's face but looked at the universe with alien eyes. And when the transformation was complete, when Torvaan was fully theirs in mind, if not in body, what would he have been? A monster wearing the drake scale of Nocturne, a creature that could walk among his brothers, sharing their fires and their forges, while something behind his eyes smiled at their pain and grew fat on their trust. They had weaponized brotherhood, the same way the Genestealer Patriarch had weaponized our compassion on Vellanoch. The Drukhari had found the thing we valued most and turned it against us. Because the reason no one had reported Torvaan's changes sooner was the same reason I had not. He was our brother. He was family. And you do not look at family and see the enemy. You look at family and see someone who is struggling, someone who needs help, someone whose silence in the forge is a sign of weariness, not corruption. The parasite's greatest defense was the love of the people around its host. Dulth gave the order for quarantine and assessment. Torvaan was summoned to the apothecarium under the pretense of a routine post-deployment physical, and when he arrived, he found not just Heskel but the captain, Sergeant Vosk, and me. Chaplain Rendern, who had joined the company from the Reclusium specifically to manage the spiritual fallout of Vellanoch, stood at the back of the chamber with his Crozius held loosely in one hand. Torvaan looked at us. He looked at each of us in turn, and I watched the understanding arrive behind his eyes. Not the flicker this time, but a full, terrible illumination, the moment when a man realizes that the people he loves have seen the thing growing inside him. "How long?" he asked, and his voice was steady, which broke my heart, because steadiness in that moment was the bravest thing I had ever witnessed. "Ghelspar," Dulth said. "The neck wound." Torvaan raised his hand to the scar below his ear, touched it. His fingers lingered there for a moment, and I saw his jaw tighten, the muscles working beneath his coal-black skin. "Can it be removed?" Heskel shook his head. "It has integrated too deeply. The neural pathways are shared. Removing the device would cause catastrophic neural damage. You would not survive the procedure, and even if you did, you would not be functional." "There is another option," Chaplain Rendern said, stepping forward. "A rite of purification. Sustained exposure to the sacred flames of Nocturne, combined with psychic suppression, may burn the parasite out. It has been done before with other forms of Xenos contamination." "May," Torvaan repeated. "How confident are you?" Rendern was honest. "Not confident. The Drukari do not build things that are easily undone. The procedure would take months. There would be significant suffering, and the chance of success is low." Torvaan stood there in the center of the apothecarium, surrounded by his brothers, and I could see him doing the calculus that no one should ever have to do, the arithmetic of diminishing returns, the weighing of slim hope against certain suffering, against the risk of what he might become if the parasite won. He was quiet for a long time. The ship hummed around us, the deep vibration of the plasma drives, a constant presence in the deck plating. And in that silence I heard everything that had ever mattered between us. Every campaign, every forge session, every night watch, every word spoken and unspoken across every year of shared service. The Drake Claw pendant he had given me on Nocturne hung against my chest beneath my robes, warm from my body heat, and I wanted to reach for it, and I could not move. "I can feel it," Torvaan said at last. "The thing inside me. I have felt it for months. At first it was like a whisper at the edge of hearing, something I could almost ignore. Now it is a voice. Not words, not language, but a constant pressure, like someone leaning against a door that I am holding shut. It shows me things. Beautiful things, terrible things, things that are both at once. When I fight, it wants me to linger, to watch the light leave, to appreciate the geometry of falling bodies." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "It is getting harder to keep the door closed." I opened my mouth to speak, to say something, anything, some word of comfort or defiance or hope, and Torvaan looked directly at me, and the eyes that met mine were his. Entirely his. The flicker was gone. In that moment, through whatever remaining strength of will he possessed, he had forced the parasite back and made himself fully present for the last time, and what I saw in his gaze was not fear or anger or resignation, but a profound, calm clarity. "Urdhen," he said, "I need you to do something for me." I knew what he was going to say. I had known since the moment Heskel delivered the scan results, in the way that you know a blow is coming before the fist connects, the certainty arriving ahead of the event like light ahead of sound. I knew, and every fiber of my being recoiled from the knowledge, and still I stood there and I listened. "I will not risk it," he said. "I will not gamble months of suffering on a slim chance, and I will not risk becoming the thing this parasite wants me to become. If I turn, if the door breaks, I could kill brothers before anyone stops me. I know what I am asking, but it has to be you. If it is going to be anyone, it has to be you." There is a tradition among the Salamanders. When a brother falls in battle, his body is recovered if possible and returned to Nocturne, to be cremated in the fires of the mountain and returned to the earth that made him. When a brother is lost to corruption, whether by chaos or by Xenos taint, the duty of ending him falls to his closest companion, because in our chapter we believe that death at the hands of a brother is not an execution but an act of love, the final duty, the last fire, a mercy that says, "I knew you when you were whole, and I will not let you become something less." I have fought Orks and Chaos Marines and Drukhari and Genestealers and a dozen other horrors that the galaxy has spawned. I have endured the trial of fire and the branding of the chaplains and the black days of Vellanoch. None of it prepared me for what I did next. Dolth cleared the apothecarium. Rendorn spoke the litany of passage, the words that commend a Salamander's spirit to the fires of the Emperor and of Vulkan, and Torvaan knelt and recited the responses from memory, his voice clear and unwavering. When the liturgy was complete, Rendorn stepped back, and Torvaan looked up at me and he smiled. The same smile he had worn in the forges of Hesiod when we worked side by side, the same warm, slightly crooked expression that every year of our brotherhood had etched into my memory so deeply that I will see it every time I close my eyes for the rest of my existence. "The fire will test you," he said. "And I shall not be found wanting," I answered, completing the catechism. And my voice did not break, which is the only thing I am proud of from that day. I drew Heshren, that which shields. I had forged this blade to protect people, had named it in the old tongue of Hesiod to carry that purpose in its steel, and now I was going to use it to kill the man who had stood beside me when I quenched it. The crossguard still bore the mark of Torvaan's pendant, the small splash of metal that had cooled in the shape of a claw. I activated the power field, and the blade lit with a clean blue-white luminescence that cast sharp shadows across the walls of the apothecarium. Torvaan closed his eyes. I raised the sword, and for one moment, one single moment that stretched into an eternity, I hesitated, because my hands did not want to do this, because every instinct I had was screaming at me that this was wrong, that there had to be another way, that you do not kill the people you love. A boy on Korveth Tertius had asked me if I was a monster, and I had told him I was a shield. A girl on Drathmere had asked me why the soldiers hurt people. A woman on Vellanoch had looked at me and known, before I said a word, that the shield had become a gate. And now here I stood with that which shields raised over the head of my brother, and the question the children had asked me found its final answer in the shape of my shadow on the wall, a monster silhouette, sword arm high, poised above a kneeling man. But there was no other way. Torvaan had known it. Dolth had known it. I had known it since the diagnosis. And the greatest act of love I could offer my forge brother was to honor his choice and make it quick and make it clean. I brought Heshren down. One stroke. It was enough. Torvaan Gesht fell, and the light left his eyes, and the thing behind them died with him, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound I have ever heard. We brought him home. That was the one thing I could still do for him, the one duty that remained after the last and worst duty had been performed. I cleaned his body myself, washing the blood from his neck and his armor, and dressing him in the forge robes of his clan. the deep crimson cloth embroidered with the sigil of Mount Deathfire that every Salamander keeps in his personal effects for this purpose. I cleaned Heshren, too. The blade that I had named That Which Shields now carried a stain that no amount of polishing would remove, not on the metal but on its meaning. I had unmade its purpose with a single stroke. I had turned a weapon of protection into a weapon of mercy-killing. Whether that was a betrayal of what I had forged or the truest expression of it, I cannot tell you even now. The question has not closed. I do not think it ever will. I could not bring myself to sheathe Heshren for 3 days. The blade lay bare on the rack in my cell, power field inert, and I could not look at it without seeing Torvaan's smile reflected in the steel. I removed his war gear piece by piece, cataloging each component for return to the chapter armory, and when I reached his left vambrace, the one he had been tracing with his finger in the arming chamber, I paused. On the inner surface, invisible unless you knew to look, Torvaan had scratched a single word in Nocturnian script. Urdhen, my name. I do not know when he carved it. I do not know what it meant to him at the moment he did it, whether it was a message or a prayer, or simply a man holding on to something real while the alien whisper tried to pull him away. I know what it means to me. It means that he was fighting. Until the end, until the moment he knelt and asked me to give him the death our tradition demanded, he was fighting, and the proof of it was my name scratched into the underside of his armor, where no one would see it. The journey back to Nocturne took 11 days. I spent them in the forge, working metal. I made nothing of consequence, no blades, no ornamentation, just the act of hammering, the rhythm and the heat and the ring of steel on anvil, filling the silence that Torvaan's absence had created. Other brothers left me alone. They understood. In a chapter that forges its bonds in literal fire, the loss of a forge brother is not merely grief but amputation, the severing of something that was part of your own structure. The other brothers gave me space not because they were distant, but because they knew that the forge was my way of processing what had happened, the same way the forge had been Torvaan's way, the same way it had been every Salamander's way, since Vulkan first taught his sons to shape metal on the slopes of Deathfire. We reached Nocturne during the time of calm, the brief interval between volcanic seasons when the world is as peaceful as it ever gets, which is to say still racked by tremors and thermal vents, but not actively trying to kill everything on its surface. The strike cruiser entered orbit, and I stood at the observation port and watched the planet turn below. Black volcanic glass and red magma rivers, and the silver-gray of the sanctuary cities nestled in the calderas, and I felt the pull of home in my chest like a physical force. Nocturne makes you. It tests you. It burns you. And when you return to it broken, it does not comfort you. It simply presents itself, unchanged, unyielding, eternal. And in its permanence, there is a kind of solace that no words or rituals can provide. The mountain does not care about your grief. The mountain was here before you and will be here after you, and in the face of that immensity, your pain becomes something you can carry rather than something that carries you. The cremation was held at the Cinder Hearth, the ancient ceremonial site on the lower slopes of Mount Deathfire, where salamanders have been returned to the fire since the earliest days of the chapter. The third company attended in full, and the first company, the Fire Drakes, sent a delegation of veteran Terminators, and Forge Father Hestan sent a hammer token of respect from wherever his endless quest for Vulkan's artifacts had taken him. Captain Dulth spoke the words. Chaplain Rendern performed the rites, and I stood at the foot of the pyre and watched the flames take Torvaan, watched the heat strip away the robes and the flesh and the bone until there was nothing left but ash and the memory of a man who had been better than the thing that killed him. I had prepared a tablet, obsidian from the deep quarries below Hesiod, the blackest stone I could find, polished until it held reflections like dark water. The inscription was simple. I had agonized over what to write, had drafted and discarded a dozen formulations, because how do you compress a brotherhood like ours into a few lines of carved stone? In the end, I wrote what was true, and truth needs no elaboration. Torvaan Gesht, Forge Brother, Third Company. He fought the thing that tried to unmake him, and he chose his own ending. The fire tested him, and he was not found wanting. I carried that tablet to the Hall of Remembrance in the sanctuary city of Hesiod, where the obsidian records of the chapters honored deadline the walls in rows that stretched from floor to ceiling. Thousands of tablets representing thousands of brothers who came from Nocturne's fire and were returned to it. I placed Torvaan's tablet in its alcove with my own hands, and I stood there for a long time reading the names around his, the brothers who had gone before. And I understood something that I had been circling for years without quite grasping. The tablets are not memorials. Not really. A memorial is a thing you build to remember someone who is gone, a marker that says here was a person who mattered. The obsidian tablets are something different. They are proof that the fire does not win, that the galaxy can throw its worst at us. Orks and chaos and Drukhari parasites and Genestealer cults and the grinding cruelty of the Imperium itself. And we endure, not because we are the strongest or the fastest or the most numerous. The Salamanders are none of those things. We endure because we choose to carry each other, in life through brotherhood and in death through remembrance. And as long as one brother remains to carve a name into stone, the fire has not consumed us. I returned to active duty. There was no ceremony for this, no ritual of readiness. One day I was in the forge, and the next day I was in the arming chamber, and the day after that I was aboard a Thunderhawk, dropping into another war zone on another world, whose name I would add to the long list of places where I have fought and bled and watched brothers fall. The galaxy did not pause for my grief. It never does. The great rift still burned across the sky, demons still poured from its edges, and somewhere on 1,000 worlds, people who had never heard of Nocturne or the Salamanders or the Promethean Creed were fighting for their lives against horrors they could not comprehend. And they needed us. Sergeant Vosk assigned me a new forge brother. His name was Kyle Thendrith, young by our standards, barely 30 years in service, quiet in the way that new brothers often are around veterans. He was uncertain around me, unsure how to approach a brother who had just lost his closest companion, trying in his careful, earnest way to bridge the gap without presuming to fill it. On his third day attached to the squad, he came to the forge while I was working and stood at the adjacent anvil and began hammering without a word. He did not try to make conversation. He offered no condolences. He simply worked, his hammer falling in counterpoint to mine, and after an hour of shared silence, I realized that the forge did not sound as empty as it had before. Kyle did not hum while he forged. He whistled, a thin, reedy sound completely unlike Torvaan's low humming, a melody I did not recognize from any Nocturnian tradition. I asked him about it later, and he said it was a song his clan father had taught him from the 5th sanctuary city of Klemen, a city I had never visited. The melody told me that Kyle Thendrith was not a replacement for Torvaan Gesht. He was not a new version of something lost. He was a different fire, lit from a different hearth, and the forge would sound different with him in it, and that was not worse. It was just new, and new after everything was something I could learn to work with. I have not told you about the Circle of Fire. It is the most sacred of the Salamander's rituals, performed only on Nocturne, only in the depths of Mount Deathfire's caldera, where the heat is so intense that even a space marine in full Terminator plate can remain for only minutes before the temperature exceeds what his armor systems can compensate for. It is a trial of reflection, not of endurance. You walk the circle, a path marked by obsidian pillars carved with the names of every chapter master since Vulkan, and the heat strips away everything that is not essential. You cannot lie to yourself in the circle of fire. You cannot hide behind doctrine or duty or the comfortable fictions that allow you to function in the day-to-day. The fire sees you, all of you, the coward and the hero, the brother and the killer, the man who gave water to refugees and the man who sorted them into cages, the man who loved his forge brother and the man who killed him. I walked the circle 3 months after Torvaan's cremation. Captain Doth authorized it. I do not know if he understood why I needed it, or if he simply saw a brother in pain and did what salamanders do, which is to provide whatever tool is needed and trust the brother to use it well. The heat hit me like a wall. Even through my armor, even with every thermal system running at maximum, I could feel the mountain's fury pressing against me from every direction, a pressure that was physical and spiritual and something beyond both. The obsidian pillars glowed dull red in the magma light, the carved names of the chapter masters shimmering as though the letters were alive, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with a frequency that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my bones. I walked, and the fire asked its questions. It asked me about Korveth Tertius, about the boy who had called me a monster, and I answered that I had heard him and that his question had never stopped echoing, and that I had no answer, only a choice, repeated every day, to be the kind of monster that stands between the darkness and the people who cannot fight it themselves. It asked me about Drathmere, about the girl in the rubble who asked why the soldiers did this, and the 2 brothers of Squad Melkari who died on the southern wall because we chose a convoy over a flank. I answered that I had carved all their names and that the anger I felt was not diminished and would never be diminished. I carried it not as a burden but as fuel, and the cost of compassion, measured in the blood of Celt and Har, was a price I would pay again. It asked me about Vellanoch, about Merath and her boy, about the walk to the isolation zone and the promise of safety that turned to dust between my fingers. And I answered that I did not know what happened to them, and that the not knowing was its own kind of wound, and that the difference between the least wrong and the truly right was a distance I would spend the rest of my life trying to close. It asked me about Torvaan, about the moment on Ghelspar when I told him to go alone into the dark while I stayed with the captives, about the sword I raised over the head of my kneeling brother. It asked me if I would make the same choices again, and I answered yes, and the word was the hardest thing I have ever said, harder than the blow itself, because yes meant that I accepted it, all of it, the guilt and the necessity and the horror and the love that made them possible. And acceptance is not the same as peace, but it is the ground on which peace might eventually be built. I emerged from the circle of fire at dawn. Nocturne's sun was rising over the caldera rim, painting the volcanic glass in shades of amber and deep red, and the air outside the mountain was cool against my superheated armor, and the world was still there, unchanged, unyielding, eternal. I stood on the slope and looked out over the sanctuary cities and the obsidian plains and the distant silver thread of the river Acerbian winding through the ash flats. And I breathed, and the breath tasted of sulfur and stone and home. I am Urdhen Velk, 3rd Company, Salamanders Chapter. I have served 63 years, and I will serve 63 more, or twice that again, or however many the Emperor and Vulkan see fit to grant me before the fire takes me as it takes all things. I carry 47 obsidian tablets in a chest that grows heavier with every campaign, and I will carry more before I am done. I carry a blade called Heshren that bears the mark of a dead man's pendant on its crossguard. I carry a drake claw on a chain around my neck, warm against my skin, a gift from a brother who will not give me another. The galaxy is dark. It has always been dark. The Imperium is cruel. It has always been cruel. The enemies of mankind are legion and relentless, and they will never stop coming. Not the Ork, not the Drukhari, not the demon. Not the thing that hides in human blood and wears a human face. I have no illusions about any of this. I am not naive. I have sorted refugees into cages and killed my closest friend, and carved the names of people who were murdered by their own allies. I know what the universe is, but I also know what a salamander is. We are the fire that defends, the anvil that endures, the hammer that shapes. We walk into the dark places and we bring the light with us, not because we believe the darkness can be defeated, but because we believe that the people in the dark deserve to see someone trying. Every child pulled from a burning hab block, every refugee given water on a dusty road, every hand extended to a stranger in a galaxy that teaches you to trust no one. These things matter. They are small against the vastness of the horror, I know that. A cup of water given to one woman on one road on one world is nothing against the weight of a galaxy at war. But the Promethean Creed does not ask us to save the galaxy. It asks us to save the person in front of us. And then the next one, and the next, until the fire takes us or the fire makes us into something worthy of the name we carry. Into the fires of battle, unto the anvil of war. I was forged there, I burn there still.